Thank you for joining us for today's EWA webinar, Uncharted Waters, What to Know About Federal Education's Overhaul. This is going to be a really helpful webinar for journalists who are covering K-12 and higher education, just because of all the things that are happening, all of the changes that are being passed down. In today's political climate, we've got a deluge of executive orders being made, policy changes being made. And as many of you know, the Trump administration has taken down a number of websites and along with it, a bunch of data. I want to take a minute to note that this webinar is being recorded. So that means that all of the conversation is on the record and that EWA will likely have it posted to the website later this week, sometime this week. Also, I want to let you know if you have a question, and I'm sure you'll have lots, please put it in the Q&A box. You won't be able to use the chat box. So put those in the Q&A box at any point during the conversation. Also, and I want to let you know that this webinar is going to go for an hour, but because we know there will be a lot of questions, the panelists have agreed to stay on for an extra 10 minutes or so to get to some of those questions. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce a special guest, EWA Board President Eva Marie Ayala. She wanted to stop in to give us a message.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us or watching this later. I appreciate it. I know the past few weeks have been kind of exhausting to say the least for a lot of us. You know, students and schools are facing so much uncertainty. I mean, just the sheer velocity of news and changes coming down are just so wide-ranging and changing every second. You know, as journalists, it's easy to feel like we're just trying to chase all the raindrops and catch every one of them and make sense of it. And even when they don't, and that is exhausting. I've also been said that as education journalists, I think we feel, and especially feel a sense of duty to be truth tellers for our communities, right? I don't think anyone else in our newsrooms work as in-depth and closely with the communities as we do. We are the ones who are in classrooms and we talk with the kids. We go to neighborhood groups and we're meeting with parents. We go to legislative hearings. We go to school board meetings. We go to the places where power makers are there trying to make decisions that are going to trickle down. And it is so easy to feel like we're not doing enough, to even feel like we're failing. And I just wanted to take a time to say, you are not failing. We are all doing the best that we can. I know each person here who has been an education reporter who's still in this business that can be wacky and unpredictable. You're here because you have passion and you're here because you care. And so we're just tackling this one story at a time as best we can. And one story doesn't sound like much, but collectively, that's hundreds of stories each week that we're doing that is detailing the impact that these changes on immigration are having, DEI bans, federal grants, everything. Y'all are doing phenomenal work. So I want to give you permission when you are tired, please rest, take a nap, drink water, cuddle with a puppy or a cat. That's your thing. I'm a puppy person. But most of all, please go into the classroom and interview some kids, talk to students. When I lose faith in humanity, I try to make a point to go into classroom and talk to kids who are making apps, who are starting their own nonprofits, who are doing voter registration drives. Like these kids will be the ones to remind you that there's hope out there and that everything's going to be okay. In the meantime, please reach out to each other and reach out to EWA. You are not alone. We have your back. If you need us, you let us know. So with that, I'll turn it over. Thanks everyone for joining us. Drink your water.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you. I'm going to jump right into the conversation. Let me pivot back to this. So we're going to be hearing today from an education policy expert and two of the country's leading education journalists. We're going to hear from Nirvi Shah, who is the executive editor of the Hechinger Report. We're going to hear from Daryl Burnett, who is a senior editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And we're going to hear from Anne Heislip. Did I pronounce that right? Anne Heislip. Oh, awesome, awesome. She is director of policy development at All for Ed, which is a national nonprofit group that advocates on behalf of students from lower income families and other marginalized groups. I'm going to start with Anne because she's going to help us get kind of a broad overview look of what's going on and how journalists should be thinking about these issues. So I'm just going to start with the question of Anne, can you help the people in the room understand kind of how they should be processing this barrage of changes and how they should be approaching their coverage of them?
Thank you so much, Denise. It's a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate it. I will say this is an incredibly challenging time to be following education news. I worked at the U.S. Department of Education for the last 2 years of the Obama administration. I thought we were busy and doing a lot of work at the time, but the volume of executive orders and actions is really unprecedented. So when someone asks me, what's going on with education these days, sometimes my response is, I hardly know. I need to go check because something could have happened 5 minutes ago that hasn't hit my inbox yet. So just really appreciate the work that all of the reporters on this call are doing and know that it is a deluge by design, this chaos to flood the zone with, more activity and more action. That's intentional. And so I think the challenge is really trying to sift through what actions are real and have an impact now versus what actions that are happening are kind of signaling things that are to come, but perhaps don't change anything right now at the moment. I think there are generally, I think of like four buckets of actions that can occur. The one that we have mostly seen are these day one actions that the administration can do unilaterally. That's your executive orders, your speeches, and your bully pulpit moments, rescissions of grants and contracts that we've seen starting to change the federal workforce and put probationary employees out of a job or put folks on administrative leave. Like all of that is what we're seeing mostly right now. Things that the administration can do unilaterally. And I just want also want to be really clear too. Executive orders don't have the same sort of force of law. It's how we can interpret existing laws, but you can't override existing law. And I think a lot of the activities on the executive action front, whether it's immigration or anti-DEI efforts from, to create DOGE and then to sort of reshape the federal government, um, all of those are being subject to legal challenges right now. Many of them have actually been put on temporary restraining orders in certain communities or, nationwide. But the real impact is that the chilling effect that happens with folks seeing these as executive orders and so almost pre-complying with them before there's been any change in federal law. The next bucket is, still we're in the administrative only realm. These are things that the Trump team can do on their own, but they take more time. That's things like regulations. Regulations do carry the force of law, but you have to go through a public notice and comment rulemaking process, which can often take federal agencies up to a year, if not longer. The Title IX regulations that the Biden team did are a good case in point on that. The last two buckets are things that require Congress as well as the administration to act. One bucket is things that can be done just with a simple majority vote. That's, confirmations. We saw that with Linda McMahon's confirmation hearing. Also, the reconciliation process. You may hear budget reconciliation, wonky term, but things that only requires a 50 Senate majority vote. We expect there will at least one budget reconciliation package this year, potentially pushing school choice and vouchers. A lot of times reconciliation is about spending, tax policy. And then the final bucket is things that require Congress and require 60 votes until we get rid of the filibuster. That includes eliminating the U.S. Department of Education. That is in statute. So, while the administration can do a lot to reshape the department, they cannot eliminate it outright unilaterally. It also includes your annual spending bills. We might have a government shutdown in the next few days unless Congress can agree on a temporary CR, continuing resolution, to continue funding levels. So those spending bills, and then, obviously like big authorizing legislation too, like HEA, Higher Education Act, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, that still requires 60 votes. So what we are seeing now are sort of what the department can do on their own, and a lot of chilling effect about that, a lot of, pretty abrupt and unprecedented cancellations of grants and contracts, um, huge changes in the federal workforce, but we haven't really seen much in those later two buckets, but I think we will in the coming months.
I'd like to also, while you're talking about what's going on in Washington, ask you to talk about the Department of Government Efficiency. Like, what do education journalists need to know about it, and what's going to happen if they proceed without the approval they're supposed to be getting?
It's a great question. And I think to this point, too, a lot of the actions that we have been seeing have been more crafted and created by DOJ than by folks at the US Department of Education, in large part because they haven't been confirmed yet. Those political appointees haven't even gotten into the building. So DOJ is really many of those folks are on shorter term contracts. We're not actually sure how long DOJ will continue to operate, but they have been going in and really, in some ways, almost indiscriminately making decisions. All probationary workers, you're gone. Not based on your performance or not, but you've been at the building less than 2 years, fine. Or sifting through, I think, a lot of the contract side, and I can't think of another instance where just virtually tons of research contracts were pulled. I'm suspecting many times because of simple Control F word searches from the abstracts of what those contracts were doing, pulling back on grants for teacher preparation programs, for instance, for many of the sort of support systems for states and districts, like the comprehensive centers, the regional educational laboratories, the RELs, you might have heard them. Those are things that are all sort of really being DOJ led and directed. And there's not a great list of transparency. Like, I can't give you a full list of all the programs that have been cut right now. So unlike a lot of the other administrative actions that have like the notice and comment rulemaking, this is not being published. So it's a real challenge, I think, to even get accurate information about what's happening. That said, there have been many successful legal challenges already to put a halt to some of these executive orders that DOJ is administering. And I do think that that's really where, if DOJ is overstepping their bounds, trying to eliminate the department, which is statutorily created, many of the positions, like, having an office for civil rights and having an assistant secretary for elementary and secondary education, those positions are in law. That ultimately the courts are where this will be decided, but the chaos between when DOJ acts and when a court ultimately decides, after many challenges in the appeals process, that chaos is very disruptive for communities, for higher education institutions, for schools, for states, for districts. And that's really what I'm worried about. Even if some of these challenges are ultimately successful in the court, what will be left by the time that happens?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to quickly go over to Nirvi, and I'm going to ask if you could talk about, for journalists in the room who are covering public schools, who are covering issues around K-12 education, what are some questions that they should be preparing to answer for families, caregivers, parents, and for students?
I think the first thing would be to be careful when you are being asked questions because of all of the things Anne just said. The situation is moving super fast, and you don't want to share the wrong thing, and you don't want to share something that sounds really right, because it's just hard to get official information that seems really good. I would be in touch with the school district or the university officials that you talk to and really understand what they're hearing and thinking. And honestly, in some cases, you may need to refer people that you're speaking to someone else. We want to be a resource, but we also want to share information that's right. So I think that's one sort of caution I would just share. I think I would be pretty anxious if I were covering a local school district, because I'm maybe accessible to parents in a way that maybe a school board member or someone doesn't seem to be. But I would just caution that to be careful there, and also ask them where they're getting their information. I think that would be one thing. I know there's a WhatsApp group I'm a member of, and people are sharing what they think are pictures of ICE agents in the community. And I don't know that any of them have actually been ICE agents. They've been law enforcement for sure. I mean, it's clearly law enforcement, but people are coming back to correct and say, actually, this was so-and-so county sheriff, or et cetera. So, I think it's really important to ask folks where they're getting their information. I think that might be a really good question to ask. Hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, great. And then I know that federal funding cuts is something that everybody is covering and wondering about and trying to make sense of. Can you talk about what's going on, what we should expect, how journalists should be thinking about that issue?
I had this idea to kind of for local and regional reporters to kind of create your own focus group, parents that you can talk to and that would not mind if you spoke to them regularly, maybe some teachers, principals, a superintendent, or other type of official at a school board, and ask them week to week, what are they actually experiencing and changing, to understand some of the changes that Anne talked about. How are they trickling down? Are they trickling down to the school district? Are they getting information that a source of money has actually been upended or frozen? Because of all of the legal action, it is a little bit confusing about what something may have actually been handed down from the administration, whether it's Doge or the education department, the White House via executive order. But I feel like almost none of the action from the White House has gone unchallenged. And there's been this ricochet of action of like, what was frozen was unfrozen, but was it frozen and it was supposed to be unfrozen. The court said it was supposed to be unfrozen, but we've read about how, whether it's Head Start Center or something else, is not seeing that their money is available again. But having sort of a focus group to tell you what's really happening, what are they actually experiencing? Has a pot of money actually gone away? In some cases, there was actually been money that was distributed to school districts even before the Trump administration actually began. And so that money may seem that it's under threat, but there's a long tail to that. I would use, this is not a great example. Title I is formula funding, so I don't think it's not a discretionary grant that's come into the buzzsaw the way some of the other federal pots of money are coming down. But that money was distributed I think in early January as one of many points in the year where it's distributed. So has not been necessarily directly touched by this administration. So having a sense of people who are experiencing schools in real life and whether or not something in their lives have changed because of federal action, I think that's a way to do a real public service to your community, is like, okay, my school actually thus far has not been affected, or this school district has thus far, despite the noise, despite the huge amount of fear that's coming down. And I would also use that group to ask what things are on their mind. There may be very important local issues. It's hard to think this way with how much is coming up from the federal government. But it may be that like a school closure, a change in boundary, some kind of busing issue, a teacher shortage is actually the most top of mind thing for a given parent or school community. And you don't want to miss those really important stories for a lot of the federal noise that's coming on. It's not to say that the federal stuff isn't huge and could have major ramifications, but if you're serving a local community, you don't want to lose sight of that and feel like you're chasing your tail with all of the kind of tornado that's happening at the federal level.
And if I could get you to clarify one thing, you mentioned formula funding and discretionary, and for the individuals on the call who are trying to make sense of this financial stuff, can you explain the difference, what those are?
Sure. I mean, I kind of want to punt to Anne because she'll probably say it more clearly than I can. But there's certain things that are baked into federal law that even if there's not a Department of Education, should we reach that point that somehow the actual agency does not exist. There's the laws that some of the which Anne mentioned that govern that funding. It has to come out regardless of who distributes that money. I mean, though it sounds simplistic to say it's governed by a specific formula that is not alterable by any kind of executive order. Could there be certain parameters or changes put into that affecting those formulas? Yes, but it's not something that can be changed with the pen stroke. It really requires Congress to actually act. I know that sounds like a crazy thing to say because a lot of the actions that we're seeing right now seem like they should require Congress to act, but I believe, based on my years of covering education and certainly at the federal level, that is required. Discretionary are things that are the criteria may be developed by the education department. It may not be baked into law. Some of the search and find that Anne was talking about, I believe Open Campus wrote a great story about a bird, I believe it was either bird or biodiversity program at a university in Texas that came into play as something that was considered for being chopped because of the word diversity. I don't know that that was intentional by Doge or whomever put that particular program on a list, but it was considered discretionary, at least for that moment. I'm not sure the fate of that program if that funding has been restored. Does that help clarify that? I'm happy for Anne to augment or correct anything I just said.
No, I got it. I just wanted to, for those who maybe didn't understand the differences or the jargon, I wanted to clarify for them. And I'm just getting a message from Emily about and you shared a document. Can you quickly talk about what that document is, how people can get a hold of it?
Sure. So this is, I would say, super weedy, super wonky. So this is not like the summary version, but Education Council, which is an organization that's based in DC, they're housed in a law firm. So they have legal experts as well as policy folks who've worked at state departments of ed and the federal Department of Ed or in Congress. They are keeping an updated running list of all executive actions that have been taken as well as the response to them. So if there have been lawsuits that have filed, what's happened to that, and there's a little bit of, their own analysis of like, what are the actual implications here? I am keeping this open on my desktop. It is starred. They update it maybe weekly or bi-weekly. So for example, if you saw the executive order about public service loan forgiveness that dropped Friday night, not yet in this document, but other actions they have taken are, and I think it's a really great resource if you want those weedy details, and it's organized by topics like immigration, executive actions related to civil rights, which there are many at this point, some of the things that Doge is doing with the sort of reducing or changing the government. And I checked with them and they were happy for me to share this with reporters. So yeah, use it as you want.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. That sounds like a great resource I will be making use of. Daryl, I want to get to you because higher ed is going to be seeing some big impacts. So if I could get you to go by institutional type, to talk about what are changes we're seeing, or what are the big things coming down the pipeline, things you're expecting. Let's start, if you don't mind, with research one universities. Can you talk about what that means and what are they facing right now?
Sure. First thing I just wanted to say, this is probably the most exciting time of my career to be an education journalist. We've been placed in the back of newsrooms for years and years and years, and post Betsy DeVos, we've become more and more critical to telling the story of education. And for me, especially, there are four buckets that I would kind of categorize as like areas that I think education journalists for a long time have underreported on that are very, very, very messy. And I think now is the time to lean in. So I would just put those categories as enrollment, folks' faith in higher education, why people are not going to college. Huge, huge, huge question. Discrimination, how colleges identify discrimination on college campuses and fight discrimination. Very messy, very complicated, very, very interesting. Funding, how colleges are funded. It is very messy, very complicated. I dare argue, as a former K-12 funding expert, funding reporter, it is almost even more complicated in higher ed, and we're going to see that in the coming months. And then immigration, huge, huge, huge issue. And we saw it this past weekend with a student actually being arrested and possibly deported. So your question about institution types, I think this is going to be a huge question. One, education reporters, again, just kind of pointing out the flaws in the ways that we have covered higher ed for a long period of time. We tend to focus on big research one institutions. They have huge communications offices. A lot of us graduate from these institutions, et cetera, but there are thousands of colleges across the country, different types of colleges that provide different types of services, different types of education, et cetera. And so what I think is going to be interesting in the coming years is, or in the coming months, I should say, is how they are going to be differently impacted by Trump's mandates. And then I will also just point out there is a lot of activity happening in state legislatures. One of the things that we are following aggressively because states have just as much power, if not more, over higher ed than the federal government. So yes, with Research One institutions, they are heavily dependent on research grants, and not only research grants, but the indirect costs associated with research grants. Huge debate, huge issue in higher education. A way to easily localize the story is understanding what are some of the big research grants? How are they involved in your local community? We had a president here last week who was describing the fact that they've been doing a lot of the research that's bringing in factories into the local communities. So how the research grants are tied to the local communities, I find that to be really interesting. And then, Denise, I'm kind of preempting the next question, but other institution types that I am very fascinated by are minority serving institutions. We all, and I'm saying this as a fourth generation HBCU graduate, we all think at the top of our head HBCUs, but there are close to 1,000 minority serving institutions. They are all over the place. Some are big institutions like University of Texas. Some are very small institutions like St. Mary's in Texas. So I would try to understand what are the minority serving institutions in your area, because they are heavily reliant on certain grants that provide services to minority students, and there is a target on the backs of these grants. So for a long period of time, they have been, and I'm saying this for a lot of institutions, why we're going to see a lot of hiring freezes in the next couple months. A lot of small private colleges have been on the brink of severe budget cuts. If they have not already had severe budget cuts, they will likely have severe budget cuts in the coming months/years. And the unpredictability of what's happening at the federal level and especially at the state level, because as I pointed out, if you think that Trump is aggressive, if you think that Trump hates higher education, if you have a Republican dominated legislature, they really hate colleges, and the sort of attacks they will be making on colleges are going to force college leaders to put a freeze on hiring, put a freeze on spending, and enrollment numbers are already unpredictable next year. So I'm kind of preempting a lot of questions that you had, Denise, but
Thank you, Daryl. I appreciate that for sure. Um, you didn't talk a lot about community colleges yet. So if you could
Mhm.
talk about, what are keeping community college presidents up at night?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm just kind of keeping in mind, and I'm saying this from my transition covering K-12 to higher education, is that higher education is different because there is just 30% of America who has a college degree. It's a small number. The vast majority of Americans do not have a college degree. A large portion of Americans do not have a college degree, but have college loans. And the attitude about higher education, it is at an all-time low. I mean, we've been doing a series of stories about white enrollment, about the fact that there's been a severe loss in faith in higher education amongst white Americans. They are very cynical about higher education, et cetera. And you see this most severely at community colleges. Their enrollment has been fluctuating wildly, especially post-pandemic. The drops in enrollment is shocking. I know this is like an undercovered area. We don't really talk a lot to community college officials, but they serve millions and millions of students. They offer all sorts of programs, et cetera. The budget cuts at community colleges are shocking, just to put it simply. So the more that you can engage with your local community college, understand how they are trying to recruit and retain students, how they're trying to serve students in at a time in which the economy is more and more disincentivizing college degrees, in which students are losing more and more faith. The traditional student that we have heavily relied on, which is white men, are losing faith in higher education, and how they're responding, why they are so quick to respond to the state's edicts around DEI, or the federal government's edicts around DEI, anti-DEI legislation, et cetera. Why, if they lose a grant, that's it. I assume that there will be plenty more colleges that close in the coming months, and this is just something that college closures provides a whole range of types of stories that you can write as to how students are affected, how employees are affected, et cetera.
Awesome. Awesome. Um, I want to ask, because this is a big question that I want to ask both Daryl and Nirvi. Um, talk if you each would talk about for people covering K-12, for people covering higher ed, what do they need to keep top of mind, like the big priority issues, and what are issues that they should put off covering for now, if there are any?
I mean, Daryl, if it's okay, I'll kick off. I would just say, I think, again, I really want to emphasize not feeling like you are chasing your tail by trying to keep track of every single federal action. But if you know for sure something has happened in your community, a USAID program that supported I'm speaking on higher ed, I'm sorry, Daryl, supported a program at a university, and now that something has happened, that money truly may have been cut off, like in real time, maybe more so even than an education department program. What is the knock-on effect on your community? That's a story that you could tell that would be very authentic and that only you can tell because you're in that community. Or if something similar to that is happening that affects the K-12 level, what does that mean for the tax base for your school district and that their budget planning for next year? I would really try to take those big, abstract, kind of far away things and find the meaning for your local community. I just cannot emphasize that enough. I'm actually not reading tons and tons of those stories. I may be reading the wrong things, but I want to know what the real effect in a community is of these federal actions, because something has officially happened, and now the school district is trying to plan for that next year. We've read about a little bit about, and some of you may have written about changes in absenteeism because of the threat of ICE raids at K-12 schools. The threat of, I don't know that there's any reported ICE raids specifically at a school. How is your school district planning for enrollment for the coming school year? If they were thinking about a school closure or something like that, what does this mean for that planning process? Or are they trying to plan for those students anyway in the hopes that maybe some of this will calm down and those families will come back? I think those really tangible stories, like ways to make the federal mess kind of make sense of it, not that it makes sense, but making sense of it in your community. I think that could be really powerful storytelling for everyone on this call and for your readers most of all.
That's great. Those are great insights, Daryl.
Sure. So the biggest thing, and I know I'm kind of dipping into K-12 here, but if I were a K-12 reporter, I would look at the State Department of Education. Trump continues to say, he himself and the new education secretary continues to say, I'm sending the power back to states. He does not say, I'm sending the power back to school boards, saying, I'm sending the power back to states. And I don't know if anybody has looked at state departments of education in the last couple of years. They are incredibly weak institutions. Everything that um, their data is public, who runs these departments is public, who works in these departments is public. An easy what happens if the Department of Education closes story is, okay, what is the what has our State Department of Education been doing the last couple of years? How have they been supporting not the urban districts? Those are not the districts I'm concerned about. It's the suburban, exurban, and rural districts who are heavily, heavily, heavily reliant on trainings, grants, accountability services, et cetera. Um, Beyond that, I'm very more and more fascinated by the leadership fiasco. But this is both K-12 and higher education. College presidents have abdicated their duties, or I shouldn't say abdicated their duties. College presidents have been mute on issues around DEI, finance, research, et cetera, for the last several years for a whole variety of reasons. In many instances, colleges are actually adopting policies so that they do not lean into anything political. And that is unless the fate of the college is under threat. So what I am very more and more interested in the coming months is when college presidents decide to speak up on behalf of their faculty or not. And this is going to become a huge issue, I think. This is one of the things that we are tracking. There is a movement in the states, and we will likely see this at the federal level too, to censor discussions on race in the classroom. So this right now, they're talking about general education courses, but this could, as we saw with K-12, this could expand to all courses in higher education. And this is going to cause all sorts of confusion, fear, etc., amongst faculty who take the First Amendment and their power over the classroom way more seriously than teachers at the K-12 level do. So this is a debate that I would just try to wrap my head around now. We're seeing bills being proposed and some that have already been passed at the state level, and the fear is that I shouldn't say the fear. The reality is that it is likely that the federal government could tie federal funding to whether or not you are quote unquote teaching DEI in the classroom. But if you look at these policies, they're very specific, that just like critical race theory laws, in which critical race theory is never actually mentioned in the laws. If you look at these laws, if you look at these bill proposals, et cetera, they will cannot talk about white supremacy, cannot talk about white privilege, cannot talk about make white students feel guilty. It's the same sort of language we saw at the critical race theory debate in K-12. Lastly, I will point everybody to a document. This is written by Max Eden for AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. He wrote a sort of like a manifesto called A Comprehensive Guide for Overhauling Higher Education. So AEI is a legitimate institution. A lot of us have actually spoken at this place, et cetera. Max Eden is somebody we have quoted many times in the past, and he has basically written a step-by-step guide to taking down higher education. Many of the steps that are identified in this guide are actually being implemented. We just saw this with Columbia University this past weekend. So it is a very sobering sort of take on what could happen with higher education in the coming months.
Okay, I'm sorry to pivot so drastically, but I really want to get this question in before we open up questions. Um, can you, each of you, talk about trusted sources? You know, we've all noticed websites going down, web pages going down, an assortment of data disappearing. Where would you guide journalists to find trusted information, whether it's organizations or a website, a database? If you could share some suggestions.
Well,
Um,
I already shared one of them, which is Education Council's lovely Google document,
Thank
which
you.
has been very helpful. I mean, I think generally, I I'm still following things, that the US Department of Education and the White House are putting out. I think it's just very clear then to know that it is being painted with a certain brush. And you almost have to like have a filter when you're looking at it to say like, okay, what if this is actually new? Is any of this like new, or is it just, new, using different words to describe something? And so that's where I go to my like lawyer friends. I talk to folks who work on the Hill because they will often get briefings ahead of time. I talk to folks like me. I was put all Fred in that list, or other policy advocates who know the federal government, know how things work, and are filtering that. I think on the data side, it is really challenging to that so many databases and things have been taken down already. I know lots of folks try to archive things ahead of time so that there still would be access to that data. So I think if there's ever, the Wayback Machine is also a lovely tool. I have used it many a time. So trying to figure out, I think in many cases, the data hasn't gone away. It's just no longer in the same place that it was. And the sort of presidential archive transition, like folks who actually try to actively grab things, I think will be really helpful. I do wonder, and I think this is an open question about, you know, data moving forward, if there is still going to be that pressure on school districts, state departments of education, colleges and universities to be reporting data in the same way, that's where, FOIA requests and other pieces because I just don't sort of think that the federal government may be doing the same kind of data collections that they have in the past. So now then going to sort of your local community or your state to request the data, I think that's something that, I would encourage reporters to keep an eye on. If you usually get a certain piece of data, we know that this comes out in August and it doesn't come out, you know, going to your state or to your local school district or your colleges and universities to ask for that.
Thank you.
I would just encourage us to go old school. Go to walk to your local college campus, talk to folks, talk to students, talk to faculty members, talk to college presidents. If now is the time to, like, especially for K-12, stand outside the school, ask folks, ask folks what they feel about immigration policies, ask folks how they feel, whether or not they think the state and or the district is funding their school properly to handle an influx of immigrants. Ask Black people how they feel about DEI. You're going to get a gazillion different answers. So now is the time to talk to real people. My biggest frustration about DEI policy stories is that there are no recipients of DEI policies in the stories. Mostly because oftentimes reporters don't actually know students and faculty of color, but they have a lot of thoughts about this. A lot of them think that it was ineffective. It's long been ineffective in the first place, et cetera. It's been done sloppily, et cetera. They have feelings about diversity statements versus what they feel about diversity training, et cetera. So that is the first thing you could do, is just go to the school, stand outside the door, stand outside the college campus, walk through the college campus, ask people what their experience is like. Secondly, I would encourage people to read policy documents. Historically, we kind of look at the headline and just assume this is what the rest of the policy document says. The story is at the bottom of the policy document. A challenge that I am giving all the reporters on my team, which is like, do not use the word DEI anymore in a story. Diversity, equity, and inclusion means three different things, sometimes opposing things. It is not specific. DEI looks differently on different college campuses, et cetera. But once you start reading these policy documents, you will know exactly what the policymaker wants. Another thing you can do is consume conservative media. They have full-time higher ed and K-12 reporters right now who are doing some very aggressive reporting that is dictating policy. You can preempt the debates just by looking at what they are covering. Um, and then lastly, I would just say build your own databases. So that's one of the things that we're doing here at the Chronicle with DEI legislation, et cetera, and how colleges are actually preempting the laws around DEI, dismantling of DEI. But you can build databases to let people know what are the test scores, how diverse are your schools, what is the makeup of, like, how many immigrants go to your school? How many undocumented students are at your school, et cetera? You have the power as a journalist to collect that data and display it in a digestible way.
Awesome, awesome. Those are fantastic. Nirvi, did you want to share anything?
You know what? Daryl covered some of the things I was going to say,
Oh,
which was make a
oh,
spreadsheet for yourself, track things on your own, and talk to real people. I just cannot emphasize enough what he said. But like, you've got to get out there. One of my wiser than me colleagues at the Heckins Report recently gave us the great advice: try to talk to a new person every day. Not Yes, you need your trusted stable of people that you talk to all the time, but interact with new people every day. You have no idea what they're going to say, and they are going to give you ideas, and they're going to shape your thinking in a way that you maybe did not think was possible. I'll just leave it there because I know there's a ton of questions.
I love that. I love that. Okay, Emily says we're ready for questions.
Thank you, everybody.
So,
So much incredible information already. Really appreciate it. I want to jump right into this. So Willisha Morris asked, she said, I understand that executive orders aren't legal actions, but it's clear that Trump and his administration is ignoring law and congressional actions. What do we tell readers if executive orders aren't binding, but schools and colleges are complying anyway?
I'm happy to start on this one since I think that was based on my comment. I mean, I think that is a very tricky line to walk where I think Daryl's mentioned this, Nirvi's mentioned this, like folks are complying preemptively. And I think that is certainly, that's by design. That's part of the intention of this, of saying, well, now Title VI of the Civil Rights Act means this, even though it's never meant that before. And just kind of waiting for this to play out, and know that a lot of folks out of fear will change policies right away. And that fear is not ungrounded in the sense, look, Columbia University just lost $400 million in grant funding. So they are targeting and going after through enforcement action specific institutions. And we're already seeing this in terms of the way that the Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, is enforcing civil rights laws. So like the threat is real in some cases. It's just really hard to predict. Like, are you going to be the institution that they go after? Are you the test case? Because at this point, it is sort of a little bit of a whack-a-mole. And so that's part of this. I think obviously there was a lot of news about the grants that were canceled, but those are just specific teacher preparation grants, like money for special education that goes out through the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. Nothing has changed right now. It might in a few months, but like for now, so I think it's being really clear about what the risk is and pinpointing that. I think certainly if I was a elite higher education institution, I would be worried right now. If I was a community college, maybe not so much.
I would just encourage reporters to go back to what we used to do, which is write about the actual discrimination on college campuses. I think when colleges started giving this DEI spin, we all started writing about the solution rather than about the problem. So you can easily walk up to college campuses and ask students of color, LGBTQ students, women, etc., what is the discrimination they are experiencing. OCR complaints are easily findable on the web. When OCR launches an investigation, what the college promised, etc., when there is a lawsuit, these are all things that are easily reported upon. And I think we've stopped writing about actual discrimination because the debate over the solution to the discrimination became more newsworthy.
I will just really quickly just add to what Ann said, which is ask those institutions that are making the changes, whether they're a school district or a college, that it's based on an executive order, why they are making the change. Like if they're making a change that doesn't seem like it's absolutely essential that they make, what is their thinking behind it? Are they just running scared? Is that what their attorney or their some kind of legal advice that they're getting is advising them to do? But ask them why, probe them about that as much as possible.
Sorry to interrupt too. Boards of regents, those meetings are public. And if you look at board of regents meetings, regents are very upset about DEI, very, very upset. There's another constituency that we don't talk to a lot, which is faculty. Faculty also, the sentiment amongst faculty about DEI is at an all-time low. So these are other pressure points that we don't really consider when it comes to who is actually attacking DEI.
Thank you, everybody. Just a reminder to our audience, we are going to stay on for a few minutes past 3 to make sure we get as many questions as we can. And we thank everybody. These are terrific questions. Lily Altavina asks, what are some little known ways the Federal Department of Education partners with states, stories that haven't been told on a local level? For example, is there a particular grant program or office within that department that you think has not received coverage?
One thing I would say, it may not necessarily an education department thing, but there's lots of federal agencies that interact with K-12 schools and colleges, USDA, USAID, as I mentioned earlier, and on and on. So you might want to look at how does the USDA's interplay with land grant universities? What's going on with that? Is there something being lost because of, you know, DEI or Title IX or something like that? I read a little bit about that earlier today. I don't want to regurgitate it because I don't know if I will restate it correctly. But look at other agencies, which is, I think there's a lot of attention on what ed does for schools, right? What the education department does for K-12 schools and colleges, but lots of federal agencies interplay with the education system. HHS is the one that administers Head Start. I know you all know all of these things, but I think that's a way to find some stories that maybe haven't been told, especially that affect your local community. I would strongly encourage that.
I think one thing, go ahead, Ann.
I just think Medicaid is a huge one. It's one of the top 5 federal funding sources for schools, and we don't always think about it that way. And is obviously, I think, going to be a huge focus of, questions about the budget moving forward. So that's another one, sort of like the ones that Niravi mentioned, that I think is also worth taking a look at.
I think it's also worth looking at things like school leadership programs. A lot of things that are being cut off are pipelines that are intended to boost promotion, especially for folks who are underserved communities and underrepresented in things like superintendentships, training academies, programs, fellowships, all of those things to help people see teaching as a meaningful and fruitful career. Take a look at what that might do to some of the pipelines that your school systems depend on for cultivating some of those future leaders. That's something that I would recommend. So Lisa Rowan has a great question, and that is how to talk with editors who are hungry for articles that address what people are talking about or worried about, but when there's so much that we don't know, trying to balance waiting too long and writing a bunch of, quote, we don't know articles. I think that uncertainty is certainly where a lot of reporters fear they are right now.
Yeah, my pet peeve right now is I think journalists are doing a lot of what if stories rather than what actually is. And though what actually is, those stories are more difficult to report, but they matter more because what's actually happening right now in schools, what's happening on college campuses is super, super, super compelling. I also have learned to appreciate reporters who pick a lane and stick with it rather than trying to cover the entire watershed, like everything possible. Find an expertise. I'm going to cover my state Department of Education. I'm going to cover the state legislature. I'm going to cover funding. I'm going to cover the dismantling of higher ed. I'm going to cover immigration. Pick that lane and stick with it. I mean, readers are oversaturated with news right now. You don't have to give a story. You don't have to answer everything. They don't expect that of you. Your editor should not expect that of you. So you have a right to push back with them. But I think now is the time to pick a lane and stick with it.
I'll just add to that, really think about your audience. And I mean, if you can very nicely say to your editor, like, think about our audience and what would serve them best. What do they really need to know to live their daily lives that we can help and answer definitively the way Daryl was just talking about, and not just add to the noise. I think people are stressed out, obviously, for just if nothing else, even if they agree with some of the actions that are happening, there's just such a volume of them that it is hard to figure out what's going on, regardless of your politics, if you whatever community you live in. But answering questions that they can actually use. I mean, not news you cannot. I don't mean news you can use it. That's not what I mean. But that is servicing them in their lives in a way that they would not have the answer to by reading a national publication or watching national news or listening to a talk show. Do something that is specific and concrete and tangible.
So our attendees appreciate that advice. They said they're feeling a lot of pressure from editors. Another concern, of course, is that some folks do not want to go on the record, and more people are asking to be anonymous. And so Anne Marie Timmons is asking for some advice on how to go to make that sell to editors. I mean, I think one thing as editors, Nervi and Daryl, you're more likely to do that if your reporter can get the confidence of the person to share that name with you, correct? Even if it's not public. There's a difference between being anonymous, outward facing, and being able to share with your editor the name of that person. Is that a fair way to say that?
My internal policy, I'm happy to share this, is that I have to know everyone that you spoke with very specifically and the context and why are we giving them anonymity. I think that it's a question, and it's something we discuss on a case by case basis. Reporters, I will say, do not, I mean, Daryl may have a different attitude. Do not promise anonymity and then come back to your editor and say, I promised them anonymity. Say that you will talk about it and you hope that they can talk to you and share their comments. And if the terms ultimately don't align with what the source wants, that, you know, you'll talk about that. But I'd be really careful about what you promise in the conversation. In other words, you may not end up using them at all as a source if they're not comfortable with their name, but don't promise that they can have anonymity and that you'll definitely quote them or anything like that.
There's an interesting policy question here. I want to make sure we get to it. It's for Anne, and it's from Joe Barshay. How do you make sense of the fact that Trump has nominated very serious ed policymakers under Linda McMahon, such as Penny Schwinn and Kirsten Basler? Why would you nominate serious policymakers if you intend to eliminate the department?
I think this goes a little bit to the ultimate goal here and the sort of the white whale of eliminating the department. I actually do not think that the Department of Education is going away. I think that it is very challenging to do. That said, there's a lot that one can do short of that. You know, and I think we've seen this in terms of being able to reorganize agencies, being able to reduce the number of staff that are in ed. And there are certain goals that I think some of these folks who I think, as you said, very serious, they share. Maybe it's about expanding school choice or views about what the appropriate role of the federal government is. So, you know, I think the Office for Civil Rights will continue to exist. That's going to be essential to carry out many of the top priorities of this administration. You know, they want to promote school choice, maybe through a tax credit scholarship or a voucher program. How that interacts with current federal funds is a huge question. And so I think there are still functions of the department that will continue on in a much, much reduced form. And I do think also, I mean, someone who's worked at the department, this has been for many people probably at the top of their bucket list of jobs that they would love to have. And, you know, when you've gotten to that level, I think that they do, you know, I think they care about public service and they see this as public service. And that's compelling to a lot of folks. You know, and the idea of the department going away and poof, it's gone. I think that's not the reality. You know, as Daryl said, like, right about what is happening right now, like there is still a Department of Education that is managing a multi-billion-dollar budget. And it's really complicated work. And changing that will take some time despite sort of the wrecking ball that is DOGE.
Thank you, Anne. A question from Jen Smith. Nervi, you mentioned briefly Head Start, and we've talked a lot about K-12 and higher ed. Any advice about tracking changes or thinking about responses in early childhood education?
Yes, I mean, Head Start is definitely, if there's Head Start providers in your community, you might start there with any challenges that they're having with accessing federal funding or any messaging that they're getting. They're funded a very, maybe somewhat distinctly than like your typical K-12 school district. My grasp from my early education reporter here at the Hechinger Report is that they're pulling money with great frequency from the federal government. So they're kind of like hand to mouth in terms of their survival. So I would find those providers and talk to them specifically about what's happening with their access. As I said, this has been widely reported and certainly not by me, but that some providers who were caught in the funding freeze that was retracted or not retracted early on in the administration's history, that spigot never turned back on for like some select number of Head Start providers. And I'm hard pressed to believe it if it's weeks into it now that it's just an accident or some kind of technical problem, but is maybe feeling more deliberate at this point. Finding out about their survival is really important. I do think that this is something where you should watch the federal picture and what's going on with the budget. Head Start has long been kind of a punching bag for some members of Congress, and there's lots of research about Head Start that has been batted about in terms of whether it's effective or not. So it could, in one of these budget bills at the federal level, I feel like it has potential. I'm saying this without any insider information here. It has potential to be affected. And I also don't know. I don't know that it's like top of mind for RFK Jr., but I think he could be influenced here. It's not his primary job as, in his primary line of sight as HHS secretary, but I think he could be influenced to change the program by people that work under him.
So to piggyback on that, and a question from Alex Zakariasin. Apologies if I mangled your last name, Alex. If there was going to be any changes that we could see potentially as soon as this summer in terms of federal school nutrition programs, which a lot of kids rely on?
I am not tracking closely. I think my answer to these things is like possibly. I think that's worth watching, particularly because I wouldn't have predicted that they would have canceled a bunch of IES contracts and teacher preparation programs, 75% of the way through spending those grants, but they did, and so I think I'm not going to make any predictions, but it's worth watching. And I think that's also a really good point, though, of bringing up like what we are seeing right now, again, is like the immediate executive actions. The entire budget process and how that plays out will be hugely impactful on education for the next 4 years. So what happens in budget reconciliation? Do they include significant education legislation in reconciliation or not? Whether it's related to the student loan program or to education scholarships or vouchers of some kind. Then there's just the plain Jane budget process every year. And, last year, House Republicans voted to cut Title I by 50%. Will they actually do that if they think now they're in charge, and is there a chance of that proposal passing? It's a different political environment. Then we don't have a Democratic president who would veto that bill. So I think watching sort of the regular appropriations process as well, we I think may have a continuing resolution that kicks the can down the road until the summer or fall. But those are two pieces that will definitely influence not just sort of education programs, but also student nutrition, Medicaid, everything that the federal government is funding.
I want
We
to
have 3 questions left, and everybody keep going.
But at least that's like kind of a what if story, which Daryl is saying, don't do that. But you could find out how many kids used summer EBT last year. Find out, get the numbers of, figure out what the impact could be. So when the time comes, you know what the impact could be on your community.
So we have 3 questions left, and I bet that we can get to them in the next 2 minutes, and then we're going to wrap things up. And just want to thank everybody very much for your participation, for these wonderful comments, especially to Denise for doing such a beautiful job preparing as moderator and keeping things going. Thank you very much, Denise. Linda Wertheimer wants to know, is anybody tracking the changes that are happening and lining them up against Project 2025, despite Trump's administration's protestations during the campaign that he had nothing to do with that, and that it did not reflect his priorities? Anybody know if anybody's tracking that? I'm sure somebody is. I'm sure if we did a Google search, I bet something's going to come up. So I would say, yes, Linda, I imagine somebody is tracking that. And if we find it, we'll share it for sure.
I just want to point out that a lot of these conservatives are very willing to talk. They are very, very talkative. Call them up. Call up the legislatures. Like, we have ignored these people for years and years and years, and now they're in charge and they're making these changes. Call them up and talk to them. Understand their theory of action.
And Maria Paletta has already found it. Nice work, Maria. I'm going to share this with everybody in the group. Maria Paletta gets the brownie points today. If you find me at National Seminar in St. Louis, I will find you an actual brownie, Maria. You can take me up on that. When I say brownie points with brownies, I mean it. If you have not made your plans to join us at National Seminar, scholarships are running out. If you need financial help to get there, we want to help you. We need to hear from you. Go online to ewa.org. We're going to go to just one more quick question. Daryl, college administrators are extremely tight-lipped right now about impacts on their campuses from federal actions. Any tips around working around the administration to get a big picture idea of these impacts?
Boil the hell out of public institutions. Go to private institutions, college campuses, talk to the employees. Um, Watch Board of Regents meetings, watch State Board of Education meetings. These places, watch legislative hearings. They're very, very animated. If you want to understand how the general public, not Donald Trump, how the general public feels about higher education, these politicians who won the election, they will tell you, they will say it out loud. So just, we don't need college officials um, to be our sole source is what I'm trying to say. So, yeah.
And one final question is from Madison Lemon, and that is that local school districts won't even touch talking about the future of federal funding because they don't want to get quote unquote political. Any suggestions on how to deal with this?
So they want to talk about the future, but what does their budget look like now? How much is coming from federal sources? Figure out the current state of things, and you can say a lot by figuring out the current state of things. And again, some of that might be Title I money, it might be special education idea dollars that may or may not be touched by the current actions, although Ann already told us that future actions could make those things different. But at least figure out the current state of things. And surely, I would hope, it's public. I mean, they're public officials, so I hope that, and their budget process, God willing, is public as well. That some of that documentation should be out there and clear. You may need some help interpreting it. I appreciate that K-12 finances, as Daryl well knows, can be opaque or certainly unclear. But find out what is the reality right now, at least.
Yeah, I'll just point out that special education and English language learners funding for these two subjects is some of the craziest stuff ever. It's draconian. So just peeking at how crazy this sort of like funding scheme is for your local school districts, that's going to provide a whole range of stories right there without Donald Trump, without the officials talking on the record.
Wonderful, wonderful. If anybody doesn't have any last minute comments, I'm going to thank everybody for joining us. A huge thank you to the experts on the panel who shared so much advice and so many insights with us to do a better job reporting. If I could, in my professional role, let you know, I'm managing editor of the Journalist Resource, a project at Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm in the process of creating a tip sheet to help journalists report on minority serving institutions, and that will be done this week if you want to keep an eye out for that. But thank you, everyone. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you at the next DWA event. Take care.
All right.